Our next speaker is a multi-award winner of cybersecurity awards, an author of multiple books on cybersecurity, and he hosts his own podcast about cybersecurity as well. He's also the Chief Security Scientist Advisory at Delinea, and he'll be talking about risk of identity and credential-based cyber attacks, a real-world ransomware life walkthrough. Please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Joseph Carson.
Hello, everyone. First of all, many thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here in your amazing country. It's the first time I've been back in quite a long time. And one thing I'm always amazed at is your hospitality. So again, many thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure. And also thank you for the organizers for putting on such an amazing event. So I was thinking about what's the best way to share with you the risks of identity and credential-based cyber attacks. And I thought the best way to take you through this and to share you the experiences is to actually walk you through a real ransomware incident. I think it's the best way because you get to see all the different techniques that attackers use, the ways that they change and the ways that they elevate privileges, ultimately how they hide their tracks and stay stealthy, and ultimately causing major damage to organizations around the world. So let's take you through that journey. So hopefully this will be educational and you'll learn some interesting insights. So the first thing is, when we think about cyber attacks, one of the things that attackers do is they want to get privileged access. They want to get the high-level accounts. In order to do that, most organizations tend to, they kind of focus on the actually privileged accounts themselves, such as privileged users. And those are the accounts, things like domain administrator or root accounts. But when I talk to organizations, they sometimes forget about the other accounts which are quite dangerous and the ones that attackers go after the most. Things like local administrator accounts, super user accounts, service accounts. And when we think about privileged accounts, they go way beyond just their privileged users to things like robotic process automation, machine identities, non-human accounts, applications, APIs that all run in the background, keeping organizations operating, especially for cloud environments, for integrations between solutions. So when we think about privileges, they go way beyond just the traditional domain administrator. They go to the privileged machines. They also expand into privileged data. We might have users in the organization that might not have, let's say, traditional high-level privilege access, but they have access to very sensitive data. That might be the accountant who has access to the financial data. It might be a lawyer who has access to legal documents. It might be the CFO or somebody who has access to potential acquisitions. So we have to look at privileges across the organization very holistic, and they're found everywhere. There tend to be more privileges in the organization than there are users. And ultimately, we have to start thinking of privileges as that all identities are privileged. It's not to say that they all have equal risk. They all have different types of risks. They all have different capabilities and damages if they ever get compromised. So let's take you on the journey. Let's take you through a real ransomware case that brought an entire organization to a standstill. So this ransomware case goes back to this particular variant of ransomware, which is known as Krylock. And I always like to kind of look at this ransomware because ransomware has evolved over the years to the point where Krylock was one of the first ransomware that became ransomware as a service. The creators of this ransomware are not the same actors who actually deploy it. They sell it onwards. They sell it to the affiliates, to others, to use and abuse it. So this particular ransomware, this organization, a large transportation organization, well known around the world, all of a sudden, on a Sunday morning, all of their systems started appearing this particular variant of ransomware. One by one, servers started getting encrypted. All the desktops, all the systems in the organization, and bringing that organization to a standstill. So the attackers are sitting waiting for the IT team to contact them and to start negotiating the ransom payment. A few hours went by, nothing. Some more time went by, and nothing. And the attackers are going, why aren't they contacting us? And they started realizing, it's Sunday morning. They're probably not at work. So let's contact them directly. So the attackers actually went in, they looked at the data, and when attackers have access to an organization's entire infrastructure, they have not only access to the systems, but they also have access to the employee contact details. They actually had access to the employees' home numbers, their home addresses, their spouse information. So they have more information. So what they started doing is because this IT team was not proactively responding, they actually contacted them directly at their homes to notify them that you become a victim of ransomware, you need to respond immediately, so please go and take a look at your systems and start contacting, and let's talk about the ransom actually negotiations. So this is quite significant. So most times when organizations become victims, they tend to find out from different areas, from employees, from security researchers, from law enforcement. So let's take you through the next steps. So when organizations do start seeing and start responding, the next stage is you're going to trigger your incident response plan. In this organization, they had an incident response plan. They had one that was prepared. They had experts coming in and defining it. And the incident response plan looked like this. They had defined ownership, who was responsible for different areas. They had different lines of communication set up. They had a contact list. They had different definitions of different types of attacks that they had to trigger different types of responses. They had different in-house capabilities. They had third-party contracts about who to bring in to help them with the incident response. They had definitions about how to do containment. They had press statements prepared, legal assessments about whether they could negotiate and paying the ransom. Maybe they had to deal with some type of compliance or regulatory notification as well, things like GDPR into doing data protection authorities. They also had eradication plan recovery, and they also had the actual definition of learning from those lessons. Now, it's really interesting. When I deal with a lot of incidents, all too often, the incident response plan is also encrypted, so they don't have access to it. So it's always important to think about making sure you do have offline copies of incident response plans. But the lesson this organization experienced quite quickly was they weren't ready. They had never practiced this. They had never simulated it. They didn't try it out. They went through and created the plan, but at no point in time had they ever actually went through and tested their readiness. And this was a big difference. There's a big difference between creating a plan and simulating it and practicing it. They had never worked with other departments. They had never worked with law enforcement. They had never looked at what it took in order to actually back up and recover the environments. They had never looked at how much storage they required in order to create images of the affected machines. They didn't realize about what types of accounts they needed in order to make sure they could actually regain control of the environment and making sure they weren't contaminating evidence. So having a plan is one thing, and my recommendation always to make sure you practice, practice, practice. It's almost like, if I ever told you and say, here's the instructions to play football, and now tomorrow I ask you to go into a football pitch and play football, unless you practice as a team, you're probably not going to do very well. And that's the kind of area here. We need to make sure we practice, 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 because that's what gets us into that natural response. So the next thing is I get brought in to help this organization recover. I get brought in to look at the attack path and find out how did the attackers get in? How did they elevate? How did they move around? And ultimately to understand about the damage caused. So these are the types of questions I come in with. I want to understand about, did they have access to domain administrator accounts, domain controllers? Did they have access to all your systems? What systems are still remaining? What systems are unaffected? What type of data did they have access to? What type of applications did they have access to? Was this isolated to your on-premise environment, or did they also elevate and gain access to your cloud environments? Because many organizations today, we've got very hybrid environments. We get different environments for on-premise, mixture of cloud and so forth. How long was this attack occurring for? What types of tools and techniques did they use? Is there any hidden backdoors left behind? What backdoors can they actually go? Maybe they might sell it on to other criminals, and they might come in later and cause different types of damage. What type of data did they take, and how did they get it out of the organization? And then what was the timelines of events? And then what evidence is remaining? Now, when I come in and I'm looking at these impacted, significantly massive complex environments, and you're thinking about, it's almost like having, when you think about ransomware, it also destroys a lot of the evidence, the logs, the actually events and everything that's left behind. So I always say it's almost like having a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. So any of us into Lego or into creating puzzles, it's like having this massive puzzle, but you've only got 200 pieces remaining, and you have to build the entire picture of that attack path and understand about what exactly happened. So some context. The attackers did have access to domain administrator accounts and all systems. They had access to significant amounts of data. They actually tried exfiltrating a 150 gigabyte database, but during the attack, we actually saw that happening, and we actually severed the actual connection. So they only were able to get away with 40 gigs of that 150 gigs, but it looks like it got corrupted in transfer. The attack itself, when we looked at evidence, I was given permission to look back 5 years of their logs and events. And as I went back through 5 years, interestingly, when you're doing investigations of these types of incidents, sometimes you do find evidence of other crimes. I did find activity of an employee in the organization who decided to make some money on the side. And they installed crypto mining software and had been mining cryptocurrency for 2 years prior to that incident. And if you do the calculation of energy costs, it was a lot of money for that organization in energy costs. But it actually traces back to this particular incident. It goes back 7 months prior to the actually ransomware attack occurring. 7 months prior, there was a successful logon. One successful logon, no activity, nothing, just a logon. And it was coming from a known Tor exit node. And then later, a few months later, there was another successful logon coming from another VPN client. And then 2 weeks before the ransomware incident, one final successful logon. And what that indications was is that we're dealing with two types of criminal gangs. One who specializes in initial access, and the other who specializes in the hands-on keyboard. So you've now got two different actors that you're dealing with. So 7 months prior was the initial access. They went on, those initial access brokers sell it to other criminals, and then the other criminals then do the hands-on keyboard. The types of tools that they used traditional tools. They lived off the land. They used the organization's own environment in order to actually exfiltrate, to move around. They didn't introduce that many new tools. One of the things backdoors they left behind, they used techniques like sticky keys in order to create backdoors. Sticky keys is a method that has been used for many, many years in order to be able to actually bypass the logon prompt in Windows environments. So let's take you through some of the next sections. Next things after we're going through and we're creating that attack path and understanding exactly what happened, we want to understand, let's think of the recovery. So my question is, where's your backup? Let's recover from the backup. The backup, unfortunately, is encrypted. So they're now faced with this massive challenge about, well, we don't have a backup to go to. This organization was now faced with the decision. They're talking with lawyers about whether or not can they pay the ransom. And that ransom demand, at the 2 days, which you get two days where you get a 50% discount, that ransom demand was 10 million euros. If they didn't pay within the 2 days, it goes up to 20 million euros. So they're now facing, can they even afford it? The chief financial officer is now looking about how do they even get cryptocurrency and how do they actually transfer and be able to make the payment if the decision is made. So they started really considering paying the ransom. And the other option I'm looking for, my job is to go in and see, is there alternatives? Is there other ways that they can recover? Now, one of the big things I do is I go through and I look at the evidence remaining and I do an asset inventory. What systems are still functioning, what's not functioning? This organization, I can't tell you how lucky they were to find a bunch of old hardware that was sitting underneath the IT team's desks that had been part of a hardware migration 1 year before. They actually did a migration. And that hardware migration, because the hardware didn't support the new software, didn't support the new versions. So 1 year prior, they did a hardware migration. But unfortunately, now they're faced with, they actually said, well, okay, now we have a 1 year old environment that we could potentially use to restore from. They used to rebuild the environment. And they were fortunate enough that then they brought in data analysts in order to go through all the infected machines and try to sift through the data and to recover. They actually hired almost 30 data analysts to go through paper invoices, stock information about employee. Actually, they had no data about employees that they had hired in the past year. They had no information about what stock they had acquired and actually distributed in the past year, what invoices they had, what new vendors they had onboarded. All of that had been gone, but they still had some evidence and some paper trails behind. So they decided, they did a combination of 1 and 3 here to actually take that 1 year migration as a baseline and then rebuild 1 year's worth of that organization. It took them actually almost 3 months to get back from a state where they actually, before the incident, to they were actually fully operational again. So quite significant impact to the business. And these are things that we have to think about, is what is your business resiliency? do you have a ransomware resilient backup? Do you have something that you can go to in the case of the attackers gaining access to your backup as well? So let's take you through. I thought, let's do a live demonstration today. I'd love to do it in real life, but I decided that since I can't have my own devices up here, my own environment, I created some real videos of me recreating the victim's environment to take you through exactly what happened. I also have skipped a few parts because we have a very limited time. So I've accelerated it up, but I'll take you through what actually happened in this organization. So the first thing is the initial access brokers. What they specialize in is basically going to organizations and targeting employees and targeting data dumps and targeting information and actually doing phishing and social engineering and brute force attacks, all to steal your credentials. So this is an example. You've got here an attacker, an initial access broker. What they've been able to do, they've been able to harvest credentials. And those credentials are not in clear text. They're actually in the form of an encrypted hash, a one-way hash. So here we have a hash, which is an NTLM hash. They go and when their machines are not cryptocurrency or crypto mining, they're cracking passwords. So they have multi-functions of those GPUs. They're running hashcat mode 1000 against the hash. And what they're really great at, creating word lists. And only after, you can see here on my machine, after only a few seconds, they were able to actually decrypt, brute force that, and be able to find the clear text password. The next stage, what they do, is they want to validate that that credential still works. So they'll use tools like Crowbar, targeting remote access, SSH keys, VPN access, and they'll look to validate, does these credentials that we just cracked, do they still are valid and still worked? This was actually the first entry that we saw that 7 months prior, was this exact action, validating the credentials still valid and still worked. The next stage, they might actually go a step further. They might actually log on and make sure that I actually can log on with this. And they'll log in, you'll basically, attackers no longer hack in, they don't crack in, they don't look for vulnerabilities, they simply steal credentials and they log on to systems under the disguise of employees. In this case, unfortunately, the poor victim of this organization was an accountant. So the accountant was the initial target and the initial system and that initial patient zero of this attack. So now what happens is the access brokers go and they find out what type of credentials, who's the victim, and they put them up for sale on the dark web. And so then you've got other attackers who are then going and buying packages. They might go and buy complete ransomware as a service infrastructure, which will come with different variants of ransomware, different credentials, different tools, different configuration tools. Even might come with a service to help them actually negotiate the ransom. It might even come with translation capabilities. Now, one interesting thing is that I'll share a little bit how I've seen AI being used in some of these areas. Now, I'm actually Irish. So I apologize for my accent. It might be a little bit forthcoming and strong, but hopefully you can understand me. Sometimes it helps when I got subtitles going. But I'm actually based in Estonia. I'm based in Tallinn. And if you're familiar with Estonia, we have a very, very complex language. And the language in Estonia has been keeping the citizens safe for many years. Because when attackers try to translate into Estonian, it is very, very difficult. And they make lots of mistakes. Now, unfortunately, the thing is, in the past year, since generative AI and the capabilities have actually accelerated, what's happened is it's lowered the bar for attackers who's doing initial access and phishing campaigns and social engineering, because now they're able to use AI to do real-time translations. And those translations are so good that the Estonian language is no longer a barrier against attackers. That barrier, that protection is gone. So if we're dependent on certain society and cultural things, that the generative AI and AI is removing those barriers to making translations in real time so good that it makes it very difficult even for native citizens to tell the difference. So that's where I've seen AI being used in some of these areas. Now let's move into the next stage. So the attackers here, they got credentials, they go on and sell it in the dark web. Depending on the credential, if it's a standard user, might be $5. If it's a local administrator, that might sell it for something like $50. If it's a domain administrator, that might go even $500 and above. So they'll go on and they'll look for those credentials and they'll buy them. They'll go and spend the money. And the attackers, of course, they don't sell it once. They might sell it many times to different people. So they'll make tons of money on selling access. So along comes the next cyber criminal guy. This criminal gang has bought a variant of ransomware as a service. They've got credentials, and now they're using their skills to do the hands-on keyboard approach. So what they'll do is they'll go and they'll log on under the disguise of the user. So they'll log in, the accountant, they've got the credentials, they'll successfully log on, bypassing all the security controls that that organization has. And this organization did everything that all organizations do. They had VPN access, they had RDP, they had multi-factor authentication, but this one machine had missed it. This is the one machine that they didn't have those controls. So now the attacker's logged on, they're checking, who am I? I'm Neo, I'm the accountant. I'm looking for what types of permissions, and this is the next mistake. Not only did they make the mistake of actually choosing poor passwords, the next mistake was they give local administrator rights to this accountant. So now what the attacker can do is they'll download some scripts, they'll execute those scripts, and those scripts would be things like disable security in that machine for 5 minutes. Just to disable security for 5 minutes. Now they can go make some registry changes, and those registry changes that you just saw disables and allows actually clear text passwords on the machine. Then we'll download the payload, the tools, because now security doesn't see them. And they'll execute tools like Mimikatz. And from that perspective, the next thing, going from local domain, now they have the actually domain administrator password and the hash. Now they can go and actually log on and check, does that domain administrator account work? They'll type it in, they'll do an RDP, lateral move to the server, and then all of a sudden find that, yes, we can log in successfully. At this point in time, now to this point, it took almost 15 days, almost 2 weeks from the initial access to the enumeration, to the privilege elevation, to actually finding all the systems, and actually then getting the domain administrator account. But after that, once they had the domain admin, it was only 4 hours before they deployed the ransomware. 4 hours after getting domain administrator access. And the next stage was to go and launch the ransomware and deploy it in all of their servers and all of their machines, bringing that business to complete standstill. So this is what you see attackers doing time and time again. And it's the blueprint. I see this almost every single incident. And you can look at different types of reports out there, but I can guarantee that almost 80 and even 90% of incidents have some type of identity or credential compromise. Now, the interesting thing, in another area that we've seen, is that data exfiltration has now exceeded traditional ransomware encryption. So now attackers, they know that you've got good backups. You've listened, you've put backups in place, and now you can recover well. But now what they're doing is they're exfiltrating the data, and the next area they're using AI is to understand that data, is to summarize it. Tell me how much this organization can pay me in ransom based on the data that I've stolen. That's what they're using AI for, is quick intelligence. So let's move in. What things can you do? How can you reduce these types of risks? How can you minimize? How you can actually get better at making it as difficult as possible for attackers to be successful? So here's some of my tips and best practices that you can take away in order to actually think about strategies to help your organizations become safe. First thing is education and cyber hygiene. And you've taken that first step by coming to a conference and event like this, by listening to vendors and speakers like myself who's sharing our knowledge and best practices about the techniques. So you can actually, you've taken that first step. You've started to learn, you've started to listen. The next step is going and actually assessing your risk of the organization from doing things like purple teaming. Purple teaming is a combination between red teaming, pen testing, and defense and blue teams working together to actually not just find the actually gaps in security exploits and vulnerabilities, but to also at the same time put the controls in place to mitigate them. And this is something that using technologies such as IDTR, which is Identity Threat Detection and Response. So using that to really find those risks and actually try to minimize them and reduce them. The next is taking a zero trust, the principal least privilege approach, is making sure that users don't have local administrator rights. They don't need them, they should never need them, you should be doing elevation on demand. So take a zero trust strategy approach. The next area is doing privilege access management, is making sure that you rotate credentials on demand, basically so that the attackers, even if they are able to find those passwords and clear text and the hashes, what you've done is you've actually prevented them from being able to use them because they've been rotated after the usage. Use application control. Control applications from being able to actually elevate or to run at an elevation stage. Decide what time that they can be used as well. Look for the reputation of those applications. So put controls in place. And just maintain a good patch and security update. Because attackers, when they get that initial access, It might be months they're sitting waiting for an application vulnerability to occur so they can do that elevation as well. So these are some of my recommendations and practices that I highly recommend that you take away and put into practice. And to help you get there, I actually do lots of research. I write books, I do webinars. I'm the host of an award-winning podcast called the 401 Access Denied podcast, where I have different global thought leaders come on and share their knowledge with you. And every year I do different types of research, and one of my recent pieces of research was around how you can get identity security, especially in the age of AI, and what you can do and the lessons you can learn for other organizations and what things they're putting in place from best practices to help them get ahead and reduce the risks of identity and credential-based cyber attacks. So my name's Joseph Carson. It's a pleasure to be here. Many thanks for your hospitality. And if you do want to learn more information, you want to hear more details about that particular ransomware attack, fortunately enough, just to give you some perspective, they didn't need to pay the 20 million euro ransom. They were able to recover, and with my help, it only cost them just over €1 million in recovery costs. So the difference, they saved 19 million physically from not having to pay the ransom because they were able to use security experts in order to actually find alternative ways to recover. If you are interested in learning, please come out. We have awesome camels at our booth. If you're interested in getting a camel, come talk to us. Delinea booth just outside. Again, many thanks. A pleasure for being here, and you're a wonderful audience, and many thanks for hospitality. Stay safe, take care, and thank you.